to share your screen at any time, Dr. Dickens. Thank you so much.
Welcome. Hopefully everybody can see that. Molly, can you see that fine?
Looks good to me. Yeah, full screen and
Okay,
everything.
good. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody is well and staying safe in the midst of COVID. I appreciate Molly asking me to do this topic. It's a very timely one with the major hurricanes hitting our Gulf Coast, and historically it seems like over the last decade or so we've had at least one or two major storms hit our either Gulf or Atlantic coast, causing major damage. Hurricane Michael, for example, that hit in October of 2018, coming in at Mexico Beach, caused between just Florida and Georgia alone $2 billion worth of timber damage. So landowners are faced with quite a dilemma after a major storm event like a hurricane, maybe a tornado, maybe even ice storms occur on their property. So there's a bunch of decisions that each landowner has to make. These two photos, the left and right, are from Hurricane Michael, and it was the first Category 5 hurricane with wind speeds over 155 miles per hour that came through Mexico Beach just east of Panama City Beach in the panhandle of Florida since Andrew in 1992. So devastating damage. This photo to the right is actually very close to Mexico Beach and Panama City Beach, probably as the crow flies, straight line, 20-25 miles inland. And if you note, one thing to point out right away with the right photo, look at the wispy crown trees that are still standing. These trees' crowns act like sails. The bigger the crown, the longer the crown, the higher the probability, unfortunately, that that tree is going to succumb at these high wind speeds to the hurricane sustained winds. It seems like the wispy crown trees are the ones that we see standing. One other item to note is when you look at where the breakage tends to occur, you know, a log is 16 feet. The first log is the most valuable log of the entire stem. And in many cases, that breakage occurs right around 8 to 16 feet. So that first log, the high value product area of the stem, is pretty much demolished. I went through Hurricane Hugo when I worked for Clemson in September 1989. I spent 9 months assessing storm damage stands in the southeastern part of South Carolina. Hurricane Hugo actually had hurricane strength winds, 75 miles an hour and better, all the way up to Charlotte, North Carolina. So you could see a swath of its damage from basically Allendale, where it entered the land of South Carolina, just north of Charleston, all the way up to Charlotte. Okay. So the first part of this presentation is going to be assessing storm damage stands. In the middle, you'll see some what do lean pines do topic. And then we'll finish up with reforestation options and also a little bit of coastal ecology, in particular gopher tortoise adaptation to two major hurricanes, basically Irma and Matthew in 16 and 17 in the St. Augustine, Florida area. Based on the two major hurricanes that I can point to directly, I also went through Irma and Matthew and Michael in 16, 17, and 18, and we gained experience and knowledge with each of these hurricanes. And the bottom line is, for those of you that have timber production as a high priority and you don't want your wood to go to waste, get the most valuable wood salvage first. It's those tall timber sized trees. After Hugo, there were a lot of swamp chestnut and cherry bark oaks that were able to get to be removed from the properties. They're extremely high value woods for the oaks, and it was helicopter logged. Categories of damage, we felt like this would be real important, so we actually wrote a paper, and it's that URL that Molly was kind enough to share with y'all. Catastrophic and severe. Basically, there's not enough quality trees standing and in good condition to thin back to. Basically, it's an average of 3/4 of the trees have been damaged, whether they're leaning excessively, broken, or uprooted. The uprooted trees with an exposed root systems are going to die probably by the first part of April of the following growing season, with the hurricanes, the major hurricanes coming in August through October. So with these severe to catastrophic stands, it is best to go ahead and get in there and get a salvage clear cut going on as quickly as possible. And we'll talk about time windows for different wood products getting from your property to the mill. Moderate damage is not near as problematic as the catastrophic or severe damage stands, especially about 1 tree in 3 has been damaged, whether it's leaning excessively. When I say leaning excessively, greater than 45 degrees from vertical, basically it would have to go up to vertical just as much as it would hit the ground, that sort of midpoint between straight up 0 and 90 degrees laying on the ground. It can range anywhere within a stand from 11% up to 50% damage, but an average of about 35. In many of these cases, I would say 90+% at a stand level. These are probably stands that you can keep an eye on every 2 to 3 weeks to make sure you don't have beetle activity in that stand, especially the first growing season after a major storm event. And go ahead and salvage that stand with a thinning maybe 1 to 2 years after the major logging has gone on the severe to catastrophically damaged stands. Light damage is where we're getting up into wind speeds at category 1 and maybe a little bit less, 75, 76 miles an hour, and less. This would be well inland in most cases. Usually there's no salvage cut needed and you can grow the stand, but again, you're going to want to keep an eye on that stand for beetle activity. Minimal damage, obviously no work is needed there. So these categories can be rather helpful, and that URL that Molly has on that one page that he showed you is the paper that we wrote back in 2020 with these categories. Main questions after a major storm event. It might be a tornado, an EF1 or greater. It might be a category 3 or greater hurricane. It might even be an ice storm. Back in February 2014, a circle around Augusta, Georgia, about 70 miles, a severe ice storm occurred, and a lot of major damage occurred with that ice storm. So even ice storms can cause some major damage in these pine stands and hardwood stands for that matter. The bottom line is, in each stand, are there enough trees per acre with little or no lean in good condition to carry to rotation? And each landowner is going to have a different number. Another main question is, we're used to being able to get into these stands. And is there sufficient access points into the stand? And stands plural if you have multiple stands that have been affected. This is very important to help with whether you're doing some prescribed burning periodically, to keep your fire breaks, and there's a number of other reasons why we want to have some access into these stands. Major storm events do show us how important stand access is. We almost all take it for granted until we have a major storm event hit it and rip it up. Response to storm event goes back to landowner objectives, stand assessment, work needed, financial considerations, and the timeline to do the needed work. Both Hurricane Hugo and Hurricane Michael, it's really, rather than all the site preps, seedlings, and planting being done within 12 months, it's more of a 4 or 5 year window to get all this work done. For example, one large nursery company sold completely out of its mass closed pollinated seedlings very quickly after Hurricane Michael hit Florida, Southwest Georgia, and Southeast Alabama. So you may not even be able to get the seedlings you want, in that first year after a major storm event. This is down near Panama City. Dr. Claybo and I, he's an assistant professor of silviculture. We're with Dr. David Harrelson, who is now retired with St. Joe Company. This is very close to Panama City and the area where the Hurricane Michael came in, and really essentially no trees to work with. And again, note these wispy crowns. These probably were the crowns of the poorest trees in the whole stand, and that's why they're still standing. They just didn't have enough of a sail, and they were probably protected by the larger trees. And again, note the break point is somewhere just shy of the first log in height. So that first log is gone, and the second log, part of the second log is gone as well. The sawmills, West Vaco in particular, after Hurricane Hugo in Somerville, well, actually down on the Cooper River, that's the pulp mill. The sawmill was stating to us that they needed to cut these break points 6 to 8 feet past the break point because there was shake in the wood. Basically, the wood would splinter up when they put it through the sawmill, and it was a useless 2x4 or 2x6. So you're not only losing it at the break point, you're losing it 6 to 8 feet either side of the break point. This is actually the ice storm of February 2014 in a circle around Augusta, about 75 miles. And again, these trees are not in good condition. I don't know how that happened. Major lean, these trees might live, but they're going to be pulpwood. When you have a greater than 3-inch sweep in any 16 feet run up a stem, these are going to be pulpwood trees. A sawmill will not accept them based on what I've been told over the last few years. Note all the breakage that occurred in here, a little bit different heights than a hurricane, but nonetheless, again, the landowner has to ask themselves, are there enough good trees per acre to work with? And that's a landowner by landowner case. I think many landowners would say no, and they would try to have a logger come in and salvage that stand. All right, so we've gone through the catastrophic and severely damaged stands where ideally it would be best to get a logger in there in a timely manner and salvage that wood, which will greatly reduce your subsequent site prep cost, assuming that you do want to do site prep, purchase seedlings, and plant that site back. This is moderate damage. This is a stand that most landowners would probably just keep. And if it's a small tract, they may go in there with maybe a tractor and a couple of chainsaws and do some moving into piles and burning. In most cases, this will be left, but you do have to keep a sharp eye on the stand every 2 or 3 weeks for ips and black turpentine beetles, because these horizontal trees, for a while at least, ips beetles will be attracted to them. So this is a stand where you could come in and do a thinning maybe 2 or 3 years after the storm event. Pulpwood prices will go up. We tend to see just 10 cents on a dollar pre versus post hurricane for pulpwood, chip and solid saw timber. So trying to sell this wood during or just after, in the first year after a hurricane or major storm event, tornado, etc., is not the time to try to sell stands with just moderate damage. This is an EF1 tornado that crossed not far from the house, about 8 miles away. And this is a thin loblolly stand. What we're seeing is that stands that have been thin within 2 years of the storm event, they take major damage. But stands that have been, let's say, 4, 5, or 6 years, and then it's hit by in this case, an EF1 tornado, they tend to do a lot better, I should say, than stands that have just been thinned in the last 12 to 24 months. Okay. There is damage in here. This landowner happens to own a lot of land. She has direct contact with loggers. They did come in and clean this stand up, removing all the down trees, and it's just a fine stand. I drive by it almost every day. This over on the right is actually the opposite side of the road, a hardwood stand with some pine in it. All the pine was felled, and this site is going to have to be naturally regenerated in hardwoods. And that's exactly what the landowner will be doing. All right. This is interesting. Behind this particular photo on the left, a hardwood stand with big crowns up 60 plus 80 feet, maybe in some instances. Major devastation here. This stand is being naturally regenerated. The stand on the right with the red circle, red rectangular circle around it, I'll call it a red rectangle. Loblolly pine stand planted about 25 to 30 feet tall. It did just fine. Now the tornado came from, you'll see the road at the bottom. It came through the hardwood stand and then went through and over the pine stand in the background, but the pine stand was fine, probably for 2 reasons. One, the heights of the tops of the of the trees being 25 to 30 feet versus 60 to 80 feet for the hardwoods in here. And probably the wind speed slowed down a good bit due to the hardwood stand almost acting like a buffer to the pine stand. So height is a big factor in how a stand of pines or hardwoods can get through or not get through a high wind storm. Hardwood stand, most hardwood stands that we have seen in South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia typically are too wet after a hurricane to get into. They're usually in lower lying areas, and they are typically naturally regenerated. There's a pine here, there's a couple pines in the background. This stand is probably just left alone to naturally grow back on its own, okay? Stand assessment assistance. Now, when it comes to assistance as state foresters, area forestry agents, and extension forester, I'm an extension forester with UGA, we can educate and assist landowners from an educational standpoint. But when it comes to getting your wood out of the woods, it's going to be the consultant and the logger. So if you have a very good relationship already with a consultant, that's going to go a long way with you getting a logger into your property in a timely manner if you have severe to catastrophically damaged stands, okay? We had a meeting in late October of 18 after Michael came through down in Bainbridge, which is Southwest Georgia. We had to have 2 sessions, and because the first time the church was full, 210 people, we had another 150. And a lot of widow ladies, unfortunately, did not have a consultant. They inherited their land recently. They came up to me and others after our first session and said, I've tried 5 or 6 consultants and nobody answers my calls, returns my calls. And I said, ma'am, unfortunately, these consultants are very busy with those clients that they already have, and they're getting loggers as quickly as they can to those severely to catastrophically damaged stands. So ideally, you really want to have a relationship with a reputable local forestry consultant, and it will help you in so many ways other than quickly taking care of your property after a major storm event. Okay, very, very valuable people, and there's a lot of good ones out there. Estimates from Hurricane Hugo on the amount of land, amount of stands that was actually salvage cut that were in the catastrophic to severe damage stands. I think the South Carolina Forest Commission was hoping for 25% of those stands that were severely to catastrophically damaged to be salvaged, and it ended up being about 16%. So 5 acres and 6 were not salvaged, which means there is a bunch of wood laying in all different directions, in most cases, of wood on that site, which makes it almost impossible to get that stand back into a plantable condition. But in many cases, natural regeneration was used. And talking with some foresters that went through Hugo that I got to know over time, they estimated that somewhere around 20 to 25% of the acres that they dealt with were naturally regenerated, which is certainly an option. The timeline for timber to be salvaged. This is in the paper, and it's also in the PDF version of this PowerPoint. The high valued stuff needs to be really gotten out within the 3 to 6 month window. These are the top 2 items here, okay? Pulpwood, 6 to 8 months, maybe even a year. The St. Joe company forester that was with us after Hurricane Michael went through in the panhandle of Florida said they were taking wood up to 1 year after to their pulp mill in Panama City, 1 year after Michael came through. And these pulp mills and sawtimber timber mills and even some of the coal burning plants can actually keep this wood, assuming it gets to their wood yards within 1 year, under irrigation for up to 2 years. It turns out Santee Cooper became good friends with the forester there when I worked for Clemson. He said that they could burn up to 10% of the wood with 90% coal and not lose significant efficiency in the BTUs produced, and also save a little bit of money. So that's a cogeneration using wood and coal collectively is another option. Damaging insects and diseases. A pine, the most problematic one, especially if you have a moderate to light damage stand, is going to be the bark beetles. And you want to look at that stand every 2 to 3 weeks after this major storm event. Okay. Oak and hickory, it's going to be fungus in year 2 and wood borers. But again, you can get that stuff out. It just probably has to be done within the first 6 months after the hurricane event for the high value wood. Okay. Factors after a major storm event are basically, the bottom line is, can a logger get to your property in a timely manner and cut that stand and get it to the mill? You think about it, they're all of a sudden dealing with lean trees, broken trees at different heights, and it's going to take them longer to cut a stand when every tree is not straight up and vertical, and they're laying in all different directions and they're driving over some. So loggers do tend to take standing trees with the broken and lean trees. In talking with loggers and consulting foresters, that seems to be the rule these days. Especially after talking to him after Michael. And in a sense, taking the standing trees, unless you want to do natural regen, will help you out with reducing your site prep costs, because you don't want those standing trees to be seeding in the property if you're going to do artificial regeneration, site prep, seedlings, and planting. Again, your harvest window, depending upon the products, is 12 months out for pulpwood, probably 4 to 6 months out for your higher value wood, your chip and saw and saw timber. Since the wood supply increases significantly, but demand is probably going to remain the same, and logger efficiency is greatly slowed down, stumpage prices tend to be somewhere around 10 cents to 50 cents on the dollar. So don't think you're going to get the same money pre-hurricane as you are post-hurricane, because you're not. What the pines look like after a major wind damage. This is mostly what they'll look like. This is a broken top loblolly pine in Effingham County, Georgia, after I believe it was Matthew. And this is what trees do. They'll set in a dominant terminal stem, and wind comes in and breaks that terminal, and 2 laterals fight for dominance. You end up with a forked tree. There's other reasons why this occurs, but wind can be one of the major reasons why this occurs. Chip moss, if it's way down low, can cause a tree to fork, but it's probably going to be in that 4 to 10 foot height. These are much higher up defects in the trees. Basically, think about it, these crowns, these pine and hardwood crowns act like sails, and the larger the crown and the taller the tree, the more wind that's going to catch that sail, so to speak. All right, and I mentioned this earlier, it seems like the wispy trees with the poor crowns are the ones that tend to stand up after the major storm event. All right, so we're going to go into lean pines next. I got to stay on time. So basically, we broke it down to not so much species, loblolly / longleaf or shortleaf, but height class. These trees are in the 60 to 80 plus feet tall height classes, and they're all leaning, and they tend to lean the same after a year or two, okay? They live, but they continue to lean. And again, if there's more than a 3-inch sweep in any 16-foot run, the sawmills tend to not want to take them. So this tree, for example, over on the left will not go to a sawmill, it'll go to a pulp mill, most likely. This is in Bullitt County, Georgia, where Georgia Southern is, and county seat is Statesboro. This is a slash pine stand. It still looks like this, and this is Hurricane Matthew in October of 16. So they live, but they continue to lean. Lean trees, 20 to 40 feet tall. If they're leaning less than 30 from vertical, most of them will straighten up, believe it or not. If they're leaning 30 to 45 degrees, some will straighten up. It's just variable depending upon the species, and if it's closer to 30 versus closer to 45, it's going to be variable. 45 to 60 though, that means it's great. It's closer to the ground than it is back to vertical. Some to most will not straighten up. Let me go back. Some to most will not straighten up, and that's pretty good summary there. Greater than 60% lean. Basically, they're closer to the ground than they are to vertical. Most will not straighten up. The shorter the tree, the greater the chance of that tree straightening up. This is a longleaf stand and hit by, I believe it was Matthew. If it's not uprooted with exposed roots, they lived, but they just stayed where they were if they were greater than 45. I go by that probably 4 or 5 times a year, and it still looks like that. The ones that were uprooted, though, they die pretty quickly. This is at our farm in Lawrence County, and these trees did straighten up with time. It's the right-hand photo over here. Okay, they're smaller trees. This is slash pine. We're raking straw in that stand right now. Trees that are 5 to 20 feet tall, if they're leaning less than 30 degrees from vertical, just about all of them will straighten up. 30 to 45, most of them will straighten up. 45 to 60, some will straighten up. Greater than 60, most will not straighten up. Although we are seeing some straighten up if they're in that 5 to 10 foot class. Okay, this is a longleaf pine taken after, what was it? I think it was Michael. And that's about the same vantage point, just a little bit closer to the road. 1 year, yeah, it was Matthew. 2 years after Matthew, it's straight up. So it's not leaning much, and it was able to straighten up. Some slash pine in Bryan County, inland from Savannah. A lot of these slash pines did straighten up, even though they've got lean even greater than 60 degrees. They're just short. There's one behind me right there as well. This is a younger stand, less than 5 feet. Most of these guys, even if they're leaning 70 plus degrees, they will straighten up. Notice the hole that was created with it being pushed back and forth with Hurricane Matthew. Okay, this is actually a Dow site prep study area that we have. This is another tree just after Hurricane Matthew, and this is, I believe, either the same tree or an adjoining tree. And this is the kind of sweep we see with these trees. They straighten up. This would probably go to the logging deck. And as if let's say this tree is 30 years old with a 14-inch diameter, they probably cut it off right about here at 4.5 feet and take that rest of the stem, assuming there's no visible defect, and send that to the sawmill and probably throw that away. Uprooted trees, they're not going to make it. If you see root balls like this, they're probably going to be brown needled by around April 1st of the following growing season. Okay. Stem quality issues are real big in stands. This is a slash pine stand with real poor stem quality. A lot of fusiform rust cankers, a lot of forking, a lot of ramicorn branches, and it really took a beating. This particular landowner was very lucky. He had, it was a wet winter, and he got some really high pulpwood prices, and he was able to get the stand clear cut. So he actually did all right. And not everybody has that kind of luck. But he was able to hold on to it until that time when prices rebounded, and I think it was about a year after Matthew went through. Just another couple of pictures of that same stand, real poor quality. All right, site prep, this is part 3, and then we'll finish with a little quick ecology, coastal ecology talk. Site prep options, this is probably the least expensive. Well, actually, there's one that's even less expensive than this. To aerially herbicide, treat the stand, and then wait 2 months for the herbicides to work through the plants. And then saw head or shear, root rake, tile, or windrow. We don't like to do these things, but when you have 40 to 140 tons of wood on the ground in all different directions, if you want to make the site truly plantable, then you need to do this. Piles do tend to be better than windrows from a site productivity sake standpoint, and then in many cases the site will be hand planted. This is a site inland from Panama City Beach in Clarksville, Florida. the St. Joe Company land. They airily applied in late July, 64 ounces of Chopper Gen 2 plus 32 ounces of methylated seed oil with a helicopter at 14.25 gallons per acre, and it did kill a lot of the loblollies, a real low basilarity stand anyway of loblolly with a lot of hardwoods in it. And they actually were able to come in and shear saw head, come in with a root rake and windrow and plant this stand. It was hand planted with loblolly pine, bare root seedlings. This cost just for the site prep, I was quoted about $600 an acre just for the site prep. So very expensive compared to a scenario where you wouldn't even have to do the shear and the root rake and the windrowing. Another option, option 2, would be mulching. This is a really cool possibility. They're laying all the debris on the ground. They're not displacing anything. People might be concerned about the carbon to nitrogen ratio tying up nitrogen, but the mineral soil's below that, so you don't want to dish that in. And this is actually a pretty attractive option. We're following a couple of these right now down in North Florida and South Georgia. And you will probably have to do, if you're planting loblolly, something like arsenal over the top, probably August 15th, maybe even mid-September. This time of year at the end of, towards the end of the first growing season to control woodies that might be coming up. Now for slash and longleaf, you cannot do arsenal over the top until year 2 through 5. So mulching is another option. The contractor was telling us it's about $350 to $400 an acre to do this. This option is good for Vblade Planning if you still have a rough site. When timber management is a high objective and a landowner is able and willing to spend a lot of money, this is an interesting scenario here where they take a D8 and they basically armor it up. They do a path with 1 D8 every 100 feet or so, and then 2 D8s, and the horsepower has to be the same. They can't do a D8 with a D9 or a D7 with a D8. They found that out real quickly. This is a ship anchor chain. Each link is about 65 pounds. There's about 360 feet or so of this, and it basically levels everything to the ground, as you can see out here. When they pull it with 2 D8s through this stand with the high level debris, they're knocking everything down to the ground. Okay, there's your first pass for the D8s with the chain to go through, and then this is the end result right here in the background where you can already see the gallberry starting to show up. That's how armored up these D8s are. You even see the side armor. There's a fair bit of downtime, which really bumps up the cost, and there's your typical root rake to move stuff into either windrows or piles. Natural regeneration is another option. This stand might be a good candidate for natural regeneration. If it's a small tract, let's say 40 acres or so, we could come in, put a fire break around it and burn, prepare that seed bed for peak seed fall, maybe do that burn in September, and hopefully we'll get some seedlings to grow. This is a stand hit by, I think it was Irma. No, actually this was Michael. And we have a lot of seedlings already ready to go. And this is what this stand looked like, a lot of uprooting, and a lot of the stand was clear cut. And I think they just used natural regeneration to grow this stand out. All right, so summary, the first 6 to 8 months are real critical, and assess your stands and get those severely to catastrophically stands clear cut. Hopefully you have a good relationship with a consultant that can get a logger in there quickly. 8 to 12 months is another phase. You want to safely clean up and do your site prep if you haven't already. Stands to be planted, make sure you can get the seedlings and planter lined up beforehand. You don't want to get the seedlings, but you can't find a planter. You don't want to get a planter if you can't find the seedlings, okay? Year 2, if you can't do this in the first 12 months, you can always do it in year 2, 3, or 4, okay? Visit your stands with moderate to light damage every 2 to 3 weeks, basically looking for Ips or black turpentine beetle. After Michael, we saw a lot of sand pine stands where it's a true deep sand, really being hit hard by Ips after Michael. So you want to visit these stands and keep an eye on, make sure you don't have an outbreak, okay? See in your younger stands, see if your lean trees have straightened up. Always give these younger stands a year to figure out if the trees are going to straighten up or not. And even if they don't, if they continue to live, they can certainly be sold later. And obviously, for tax purposes, determine your casualty loss if you have any, and establish a timber basis if one already hasn't been established. Okay. For unsalvaged stands, natural regeneration might occur 20 to 25% of the time in the smaller tracts. Most hardwood stands, the best option tends to be natural regeneration. Basically, leave it alone and let it grow back on its own. For pine artificial regeneration, it's going to be a case-by-case prescriptions based on the debris level, landowner near and long-term objectives, and dollar per acre that each person can afford. Try to line up that site prep, order the seedlings, and have the planting crew committed for that winter. Basically has to be done in the same year. The window to get most or all of these stands reforested that were catastrophically to severely damaged is usually 4 to 5 years when you have a hurricane like Hugo or Michael. Okay. All right, we're going to finish up. I'm almost on time. Try to finish here in the next 3 minutes. I looked through a bunch of papers because this is not my area of expertise. A lot of them were from Florida colleges and universities. This is one in particular that I picked out. And it's interesting. The title of it is Changes in Coastal Gopher Tortoise Burrow Characteristics and Density Following basically Hurricanes Matthew and then Irma in Northeast Florida with implications for conservation planning. I know Barbara Blonder. She's an associate professor in natural sciences. She's a relative of ours and a pretty good scientist. And this is a really interesting paper. Okay, the study area is situated right here near St. Augustine below Jacksonville. And she looked right on the dunes area. This is interesting. This is a pre-Hurricane Matthew, which was October of 16. And then Irma came through the same area and affected it even more in September of 17. This is a vegetated dune swale. Let's see if I can get my pointer. Hopefully y'all can see my pointer right here. And this is where a lot of the gopher tortoises would burrow. This is after Hurricane Matthew and Irma, that same area. Basically that first dune is gone, okay? And you're left with this dune over here. So what they did was they looked at 16 in green is pre-Hurricane Matthew and Irma. 18 in blue is post-Hurricane Matthew and Irma. So they looked at the number of burrows that were active in the first bar here, pre-Hurricane Matthew and Irma was 183, and then post-Hurricane it was 243. Inactive was 148, and then post-Hurricane was 70, meaning more of the activity occurred in new and active burrows. Abandoned was 70 pre-hurricanes and 47 post-hurricanes, and a slight difference pre-hurricane versus post-hurricane. 396 pre-hurricane of burrows, and then 358. That's about a 10% difference. So they did recover. They adapted by moving inland, which was interesting. They have a, this is, I'll get to that slide in just a second. Vegetative change map. This is pre-hurricane. The vegetation came all the way down to the sandy beach. As you saw in that slide, pre-hurricane with the dune swale. Post-hurricanes, the vegetation moved back due to the impact of the 2 hurricanes on the coast. But it's recovering. So that's the cool thing about time. Time tends to take care of things and heal wounds. Pre-Matthew, the top bar, that's the vegetated area in hectares for their study. Post-Hurricane Matthew, pre-Hurricane Irma, you see a change. You see a negative change in vegetative cover. Okay, the blue is showing you that it's negative because it's going to the left of 0. Post-Irma, it got even worse, showing a even further negative change in vegetation cover. But 1 year recovery, we actually have almost a 20% gain back So time tends to heal these wounds after a major hurricane event. This is a really interesting slide. The blue dots are pre-hurricane burrow sites, okay? And if you notice, they are very close to the shoreline, to the sandy beach. Post-hurricane in yellow, they're moving inland. They're finding higher ground, and this is what we would expect. So in summary, for the ecological impacts from major storm events, this is really not my area of expertise. Animals, because they can move, tend to move to more suitable new habitat and away from storm damage areas that are no longer suitable habitat. And that's in the near term. The same can be said for insects, moving to more suitable habitat, but trees, on the other hand, they can't move. They're sessile, and so time and management will aid in forest recovery. One side note, I was preparing the house. We lived in Goose Creek, just inland from Charleston. In September of '89, I took the day off to prepare the house for the hurricane as best I could. And probably somewhere in the tens of thousands of birds were flying southeast to northwest. And they knew something was up, and it was one of the coolest things I'd ever seen in my life. So even the birds know what's going on. And I guess it was the major change in the barometric pressure. So with that, Molly, I don't know if I have enough time for questions. Okay, unmute yourself. It's okay.
Classic. I swear. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. And yeah, we definitely have some time for questions.
Okay.
We can go for about 15 minutes if you've got time.
I'm fine. Yep.
All right,
Yep.
Great. All right. Yeah, we've got some good ones here. Let me pull them up. All right. So, oh, someone just wondered, what is the size of the typical stand that you were talking about?
Well, the reforestation sites that we're working with in Southwest Florida and Southwest Georgia are anywhere from very small. This is actually Tyndall Air Force Base, right on Panama City Beach and Mexico Beach. It took a beating. And so we are working with land managers that might have 100,000 acres of land down to the 40 acre landowner. And for the smaller landowner, it is very hard to get a logger to come to their property. I will say that. And in many cases, the smaller landowner may have to lean towards natural regen, which is okay. But that's, again, a case-by-case call. And after Hugo, I spent 9 months visiting stands of all different levels of damages and size. So it all goes back to the case-by-case call, getting a logger to do the salvage work and getting that stand plantable, if that's your objective. And it goes to the size of your pockets. It's interesting, the Tyndall Air Force Base, they were actually making money. They did whole tree chipping. They brought trees with your traditional cut down machine and skidder to the logging deck, but because they were broken up, they would feed these stems into this huge chipper, and it would flow right into the back of a 53-foot long trailer. At first they were making money, but they end up spending upwards of $900 an acre to get those stands clean. So, yeah. So that question goes back to, we've dealt with from 40 acres all the way up to 75 to 100,000 acre landowners and land managers.
Okay. Yeah, that really gives us some perspective. Okay, I think you may have touched on this, and a couple of them you may have, or I know that you have, but we can maybe just reiterate.
Okay.
Have you seen any root issues with the small trees that have been pushed over?
Yes. If you have a root ball sort of mounded, and those are going to be trees where you're going to want to watch. We have our Lawrence County, Georgia farm had some of those, and some would make it and some would not. If you get air pockets in that root ball, exposed root mound is what I should call it, root mound rather than a root ball. Some of those trees, well, especially if there's a good bit of air in that root mound, those trees are most likely going to die. Air is a small amount of oxygen is great for roots, but you don't want a lot of air pockets in your root system, because they're gonna die, and especially uprooted trees are gonna die.
Yeah. Okay, so regarding a question of straightening up the stand, as well as height, did they find that other strong factors affecting the chance of a tree? Oh, did they find any other strong factors affecting the chance of a tree straightening up? For example, those that affect root development, such as soil type, aspect, ground prep, or
Yeah,
plant stock
I'm
type.
glad they asked that question. We have a longleaf stand that was planted on a poorly drained pelham soil. And that's really an off-site soil for longleaf pine. It did great until the hurricane came, and that happened to be an unusual. It's a poorly drained soil to begin with. So it had plenty of water for the longleaf pine. The problem is, before a hurricane, you tend to get a lot of rain, and even after a hurricane, with rain bands on the end of a hurricane, um, it got extremely wet, and a lot of those trees literally fell over and either died or never went straight back up. And there was actually an Ips beetle problem in that stand. So
Oh, wow.
um, yeah, it all goes back to the poorly drained soils, unless they're bedded, um, tend to be problematic because you tend to get a lot of rain with a hurricane, especially. Um, so root systems do become very important in how trees handle a hurricane, a tornado, maybe even an ice storm. But those crowns and the crown heights and lengths and leaf area index levels, really, they become a sail. And if you're talking about 150-mile-an-hour winds, I don't know a whole lot of trees that can handle 150-mile-an-hour winds. And I think that's why they call major hurricane is a category 3 or better, and that's 110, 111 miles an hour. And if you think about it, if you've got sustained winds of 110, 111 for 2 or 3 hours on the front end, Hugo, we sat through the eye of Hugo in '89. For 45 minutes, we were on the front end of the hurricane. We had an eye for 45 minutes over us, dead calm. Your ears would pop due to the change in barometric pressure. And then the back end of the hurricane, um, 135-mile-an-hour winds. I don't know a whole lot of trees that can handle that unless they're short. Height seems to be the biggest factor. And then once they're big, if they've been thin within 2 years, they take a beating. And if they have big crowns, unfortunately, those are the ones that are going to break, like these guys here in this picture.
That's right. That kind of leads into the next one. Somebody had a question regarding the wispy crown trees left over after a storm. Are those
Right.
getting taken out during the salvage logging, or are they being left for
They
possible regeneration?
they should be, because they're going to be the poorest genes for that next rotation.
Yeah,
If you really want good genes on the site, you really want your best trees. And unfortunately, these are probably the best trees are probably all the ones laying on the ground here. Now, I do see some good trees in the background. And for loblolly pine, you don't need but 6 to 10 trees per acre to fill in an acre full of seed. Now, slash and longleaf, it's a different story. For longleaf, you probably want 30 or 40. So the wispy trees, I would remove those if you do a salvage clear cut, because they're really, the genetic pool that they're from is not good. You don't want a bunch of slow growing trees for your next rotation.
right. True enough. Okay, a bit of a turn. This is regarding mulching site
Mhm.
prep as an
Right.
option. This person was saying that it'll be interesting to hear how successful that is for tree establishment. We
Mhm.
find the nutrient flush really favors grass, meaning they depend on chemical to get the trees going, and there's really no opportunity for natural regeneration.
Right. Yeah. If you mulch a site and you remove all the potential seed trees, and if there's seed in place or even seedlings, mulching is going to destroy all that. So you will need a chemical treatment ideally, if your goal is to really improve survival and long-term growth in a given stand. Now, the Tyndall Air Force Base does not believe in using herbicides. And they planted longleaf pine. We've got one study already that's in its first year, finished its first growing season last this October, November. David Claybaugh went in there, and it has the poorest survival because the competition is just way too fierce. They just believe in either whole tree chip, maybe drum chop, usually no, maybe burn if they can, oftentimes no, just go in there and plant. And when you do that, all that competition, especially down in the flatwoods, grasses, gallberry, tie-tie, wax myrtle, feather bush are all going to come back. And we had a hard time even finding the seedlings. So
There you go. Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Oh, somebody, this is just a comment. If you have a pellet mill market within reach, we were able to blend the Hurricane Michael salvage for 18 months, as long as the logs could be loaded, helping to clean up sites.
That's great. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good to hear. That's great news.
Yeah.
So for hardwood, if the most pallets, I believe, are made out of hardwoods, that window can be extended out 18 months, which is really good news for landowners, for sure.
Certainly, certainly.
Thank you for whoever added that comment.
Yeah, I'll have to find it in the chat box. I didn't grab their name, but that is good news.
Yeah.
Someone wanted to know, did anyone burn the piles or windrows in order to aid in site preparation?
We have not, with the studies that we're following, and we've driven a lot of miles, and I have yet to see a set of piles or windrows burn, which, you know, in a way is unfortunate because you could potentially increase the plantable area, and that area where the piles and windrows are burned are going to grow gangbusters, and the trees go gangbusters next to windrows anyway, because usually a little bit of topsoil is moved into the windrow and the edge of the windrow. So, but unfortunately, I have not seen piles of windrows burn in my travels.
Okay. Have you seen situations in which trees lifted and then reset upright? If so, were they more likely to be infested with bark beetles?
I have not seen that. I have not seen that.
Wild.
Yeah. Interesting question.
Yeah. It makes me wonder if they'd have. Do we have any data about wood quality of the trees that do straighten back up?
Yes. There's a lot of compression wood, which is not good wood, in trees that have excessive bow or sweep. And Dr. Alex Clark and Dick Daniels, who used to work for Westvaco, who was a biometrician for UGA, he just recently retired, did a number of wood quality papers after Hurricane. I think they did them after Hurricane Hugo. So there are some papers out there. I don't have them on hand, but I think if you Google Daniels and Clark, first name is Richard Daniels, PhD and a biometrician at UGA, and then Alex Clark was with the Forest Service. I believe you'll come up with some of those papers.
Okay.
Very good question. Very good questions. And oh gosh, he was our wood quality guy. Laurie Shimlick is another one. Yeah, I think he worked with them a lot on those wood quality issues. Yes, sir. There are certainly some wood quality issues with the lean pines, especially if you look back here, back in the stand. These lean pines on the other side are going to have compression wood, and compression wood makes some very. It's a lot different wood quality than on the other side of the tree. And again, I'm not going to go any further than that because I'm not going to go in an area where I don't have expertise, but I've been told that there are all sorts of issues. And that's another reason why they cut these trees, like this tree right here, this broken one. Hopefully y'all can see my pointer. The first log is gone. So they're working with about 8 feet beyond where this tree was snapped, if it was still living. Okay, and this tree looks like it. This picture was taken well after Hurricane Michael because none of these crowns are still living. But anyway, if it was living, the only usable portion of the wood that would go to any mill would be from about here to about a 3-inch top. Okay, and it would be pretty much, you'd cut it about 6 to 8 feet from the break, and that would be the usable amount. So the first log, which is the biggest part of that stem, which might dictate that if it wasn't broken, it would go to a sawmill. All of a sudden, it's going to a pulp mill. So
Yeah.
it changes from, let's say, I'm using Timber Mart South, $27 a ton for saw timber down to, let's say, 13 a ton for pulpwood, depending upon what part of Georgia in particular you're living. If you're in the Piedmont, it might be $8 a ton. So it's a big dramatic, let's call it a 3 or 4-fold difference between saw timber and pulpwood.
Wow.
If you're not living in the coastal counties right now, ironically enough, though, saw timber and pulpwood and chip and saw are really strong due to how wet it's been if you have high and dry land.
Uh-huh. Okay. Okay. This is the last one that's come in.
Okay.
Someone wanted to know, what is the herbivory pressure like in the Southeast? How are your forests able to regenerate with desired species if no downwood removal occurs? Is there intensive deer exclusion and invasive species management?
Oh gosh, that's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
The downwood, if it's not removed, can be problematic to have access in. This site could be theoretically, and this is where Dr. Claybo and I would like to find some small landowners that would allow us to do 30 or 40 acres of basically a herbicide, wait 2 months, burn, and come in and hand plant in something like this and follow that, a very low cost option. And but we haven't found anybody to do that with yet. So access would be a problem in here until this stuff decomposes. So, if access is important, it could be problematic in the stand. Now, invasive species, there is some problems with, for example, Kogon grass. When heavy machinery is moved from one site to another, you could be bringing in some rhizomes and actually creating a problem. And that's where washing your equipment after it leaves one site, but before it goes to another, is extremely important. So we're not transporting Kogon grass rhizomes, for example.
That's an excellent point.
So yeah, we do need to, we are also looking at invasive plants occupying. We have 14 reforestation study areas with Pat Minogue, Florida. And we're looking closely to see if any invasive plants are coming into it. So far, no problems yet.
Okay. Okay. Excellent. Well, I think that about wraps it up for us. I really wanted to thank you again, Dr. Dickens. I know I learned a ton. We really appreciate you giving us some of your time here today.
You're welcome. Glad to do it.
Folks, I'm going to go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry.